He only wanted to clean the floors, not make history. But one night, under the glittering chandeliers of Manhattan's richest club, a black janitor touched a piano he wasn't supposed to touch, and the world around him stopped. Laughter filled the air, cruel and cutting, as hundreds waited for him to fail. Yet what they didn't know was that behind those callous hands lived a secret, one powerful enough to silence every whisper of doubt. What happens when a man they tried to humiliate becomes the one they'll never forget? He thought it would be just another shift for 7 years. Daniel Hayes lived in the shadows of the city he once dreamed would make him. By dawn, he scrubbed marble floors and emptied crystal ashtrays at a private club where billionaires traded stock tips like secrets. By dusk, he rode the subway back to a cramped Brooklyn apartment, where his mother's dialysis machine hummed beside unpaid bills and his sister studied under a flickering lamp. Music had been his language once, before his father's accident, before the scholarship he'd sacrificed to keep his family alive. The world called him a janitor, but his hands still remembered something more, a rhythm, a grace, a purpose that no uniform could erase. Each night, as he mopped the floors beneath chandeliers worth more than his entire block, he'd pause by the grand piano in the ballroom. He'd never touch it, not because he couldn't, but because he knew what they'd say if he did. He didn't know it yet, but soon that same piano would become his stage, his test, and his reckoning. He thought he'd learned to stay invisible, but someone was about to make sure the whole world saw him. But that night, everything changed. That morning began like every other, until it didn't. Daniel was polishing the marble floors of the Meridian Club when the sound of laughter spilled from the ballroom. The kind of laughter that didn't invite you in, it pointed at you. When he looked up, he saw her, Victoria Sterling, billionaire heiress, diamond flashing like a weapon, surrounded by Manhattan's elite. Her gaze found him like a searchlight. She didn't need to say the words for everyone to understand. He didn't belong there. But then she did. Her voice, smooth as glass, cut through the air, mocking, daring, humiliating. "Play this piano and I'll marry you." The room erupted in cruel amusement. It wasn't about marriage. It was about reminding him of his place. Daniel felt every eye on him, the weight of centuries pressing down like invisible hands. He'd been ignored all his life, but never like this, never turned into a spectacle. That night, her words followed him into the subway, echoing over the rattle of steel and the hum of exhaustion. His reflection in the window looked like a man caught between two worlds, one that had shut him out, and one he was too tired to keep knocking on. At home, his mother's breathing was shallow, her dialysis machine clicking like a metronome of worry. His sister's acceptance letter to Columbia sat unopened on the counter. Full scholarship, but they needed a music supplement by Friday. Maya wanted him to record it. She needed him too. But how could he face a piano after what happened? He lay awake that night, hands aching from work, heart aching from humiliation, thinking of the life he'd traded for survival. Every insult he'd swallowed, every opportunity denied because of the color of his skin, every time he'd been told he wasn't enough, all of it built into a quiet rage he didn't know how to name. The next morning, the club buzzed with whispers. Victoria Sterling had announced a charity gala that evening, one she promised would be unforgettable. Cameras would be there. The city's most powerful people would attend. Daniel tried to keep his head down, but when he passed the ballroom, he saw it again, the Steinway, polished and perfect, waiting like fate itself. And then she appeared, her perfume trailing power and arrogance, her eyes cold with amusement. She didn't have to say anything. Her smirk said it all. Tonight, she would finish what she started. Daniel returned to his work, but something in him shifted. Every sweep of the mop became an act of defiance, every breath a quiet vow. He thought about his grandfather, who'd taught him piano on a beat-up keyboard in Harlem, who'd said, "They can take everything, but not your gift." That night, as the ballroom transformed into a temple of wealth and hypocrisy, Daniel understood that Victoria's cruelty wasn't just personal. It was systemic. It was the sound of power mocking potential. When the gala began, the lights shimmered, champagne flowed, and the crowd sparkled with entitlement. Victoria took the stage, her voice echoing through the room, dripping with false generosity. Then her tone shifted. "Before we begin," she announced, "a small demonstration." And when her eyes found Daniel again, The crowd turned with her. "Our janitor seems quite fascinated by the piano," she said, feigning innocence. "Perhaps he'd like to show us what he can do." Laughter rippled, sharper this time. Phones came out. Cameras blinked. The humiliation she'd promised had arrived. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. If he refused, he'd be confirming everything she believed. If he accepted, one wrong note would destroy him. He felt trapped between dignity and despair. But in that impossible space, something ancient stirred inside him. The echo of every ancestor who'd been told to know their place. The memory of every locked door he'd learned to open quietly. Slowly, he lifted his head. The ballroom fell silent. His hands, those same hands that had scrubbed their floors, flexed at his sides. He took a step toward the piano. He thought this was just another night of survival. But what came next would make the world remember his name. The ballroom fell into a silence, so complete it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Under the glow of 1,000 chandeliers, Daniel Hayes stood before the Steinway grand piano, surrounded by 200 of Manhattan's wealthiest faces, each one waiting for him to fail. Victoria Sterling stood just steps away, her smile sharp as cut glass, the 10-carat ring she placed on the piano glinting like a dare. Cameras hovered. Phones lifted, hashtags forming before the first note was played. To them, this was entertainment. To Daniel, it was survival. He sat down, spine straight, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of everything this moment represented. For years, his music had been buried under exhaustion and quiet obedience. But when his fingers touched the keys, the room shifted. The first notes rose like breath after drowning. Soft, deliberate, hauntingly precise. The melody of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the air, not as performance, but as confession. Each note carried the echo of his father's final promise, his mother's struggle, his sister's hope. The audience expected clumsy noise, but what they heard was mastery, the kind that silenced arrogance itself. Gasps rippled to the crowd as Daniel's tempo climbed, his fingers a blur of discipline and passion fused into defiance. Every crescendo was a heartbeat, every decrescendo a memory of what he'd lost. Victoria's smirk faltered, her confidence unraveling with each perfect phrase. She tried to laugh, to recover control, but her voice was drowned beneath the storm of music. Daniel wasn't playing for her anymore. He was playing for every man who'd been told he didn't belong, for every black artist whose genius had been ignored until it served someone else's narrative. The final passage came like thunder, his hands flying, his body swaying, his soul unleashed. And then silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the first clap, from Dr. Whitman, hesitant but sincere. Another joined, then another, until the entire ballroom rose, applause crashing like a wave that refused to stop. Victoria stood frozen, her face drained of color, her power dissolving in front of the cameras that had once been her shield. Daniel rose from the bench, sweat glistening on his brow, eyes steady, unashamed. The man they'd mocked now commanded the room with nothing but truth and talent. Victoria tried to speak, but her voice trembled, a queen dethroned by her own cruelty. Daniel looked at her, not with hatred, but with calm finality, as if to say, "This is what you tried to bury." For the first time in his life, he didn't feel small. He felt seen. And as the applause thundered on, one thought anchored in his mind. He hadn't just played a song. He'd reclaimed his name, his worth, his humanity. But while the room erupted in awe, the real world beyond those marble walls was still watching. And what happened next would prove whether this moment changed hearts or just headlines. The applause at night echoed long after the lights dimmed, but what followed mattered more than any ovation. Within hours, the video of Daniel Hayes' performance spread across the internet. Shared, debated, dissected. The janitor who played like Mozart. The headlines called him, but beneath the admiration lurked a painful truth. The world only noticed his genius once it first humiliated him. Offers poured in, interviews, scholarships, concert invitations. But Daniel didn't chase them. He went home, to the same apartment, the same humming dialysis machine, the same sister waiting with tears in her eyes. For the first time in years, he sat at their worn-out keyboard, not to practice, but to breathe, He hadn't played for fame that night. He'd played to remind the world and himself that dignity doesn't need permission. Victoria Sterling's empire wobbled under public outrage. The same cameras that once adored her now dissected her cruelty frame by frame. She issued apologies written by lawyers, not remorse. But Daniel didn't answer her calls. Some stories don't need confrontation. They need consequence. Months passed, and Maya began her first semester at Columbia, her brother's recording submitted as her music supplement, the one that opened every door. Their mother's health slowly improved after a community fundraiser, started by strangers who'd watched Daniel's performance and saw more than a viral moment. They saw humanity reflected back at them. Yet beneath the hope, an ache remained, the knowledge that if Daniel hadn't touched those keys, he'd still be invisible. Because in a world still fractured by race and class, brilliance too often needs to bleed before it's believed. That night, Daniel's music did more than silence a room. It exposed a truth older than the song itself, that equality shouldn't have to perform to be respected. Standing at Lincoln Center months later, ready to play again under his own name, Daniel looked out the crowd and thought about every person still cleaning floors under the weight of someone else's gaze. He knew his story wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last. But it was proof that grace can live even in the aftermath of cruelty, that talent can be protest, and that music can carry what words cannot. Because racism doesn't just break systems, it tries to break belief. And sometimes, the loudest rebellion is simply to keep playing. So, the question remains, how many more Daniel Hayes will the world overlook before it learns to listen? Before talent, humanity, and worth are recognized without needing to prove their right to exist?